Oh, hello, didn't see that. I was just thinking about how much I love Keats. Anyway, welcome to lesson 8. We have now studied Lamia so intensely over the last 7 lessons. Well done, really, really good. And what we're going to do now is really think about how it fits into our study of Keats as a whole and then to our study of tragedy as a whole as well. That's really important because, believe it or not, what we've done so far is just a start. You've got to take the knowledge that you've got of Lamia, think about what you think about it, get some opinions, work on it, interact with it, and eventually be able to answer a question in the exam. You don't know what they're going to ask you, it's going to be some aspect of tragedy. You have to think about how Lamia fits in with tragedy for you. So there's going to be lots more tasks now rather than annotations, lots of moments where you'll need to pause it and work on the videos there as well. Let's get going with lesson 8. I thought it might help you to understand the different layers of this poem by using the distracted boyfriend meme, probably my favourite meme of all time, right? So have a look at it here. You've got Lysias, and he's happily living a scholarly life with Apollonius, and his head is quite literally turned by Lamia, leading to his complete downfall and ultimately death. Okay, we get that, we know the plot from here. So if we take that forward and look at it in an allegorical fashion, Keat then is the man who is with Charles Brown, just living this poetic existence, the two of them, concentrating on creating this great art and living in a way that is appropriate to his, station in life, basically. And of course, he gets distracted by Fanny, okay, and she consumes his thoughts and everything, and he can't think about anything but her. And if we take that to the kind of next allegorical layer as well, if we think of Keats, Lysias, the poet, all right, so if we see this in a more universal fashion, the poet knows that reason is a useful way of living your life, that there are certain rules you have to live by in society, certain ways you have to write in poetry. So remember, Keats is writing in the Age of Reason, this Enlightenment period, where logical thought was seen as king. But he didn't like that at all. He had his head turned by passion, love, and freedom. And in that respect, he suits the Renaissance much better as a time period. So Keats is saying through this poem that you can have all the reason, whatever, yeah, fine, but passion and love and freedom, these are the things that dominate the thoughts. Do we need them? Are they a distraction, literally like in this meme? But they're one that you can't stop looking at. You can't stop being obsessed by like he is. From now on, we're going to be looking at some really big questions about tragedy. Some big questions. And we'll be thinking about how Lamia fits into that, how you can use Lamia and the other Keats poems in an answer, okay? Now, let's really focus on this now. We're not studying Lamia. I mean, I know we are, right? But we're not studying Lamia. We're studying tragedy through Lamia, through Keats's poetry, through Death of a Salesman. We are studying tragedy. So, you need to know all that stuff about Lamia, of course, but you need to keep your eye on the big questions, what you're going to be asked, and how Lamia fits into that. So here's your first big question then. Okay, it's pretty big, as you can see from the font. Who is the tragic hero here? Do tragedies have to have a tragic hero, etc.? All right. So we've gone quite a long way, haven't we, from the Aristotle version of a tragedy as being somebody of high status who has a hamartia, fatal flaw in their character, which brings about their downfall. There may be an anagnorisis, or these Greek words used, where they realise the moment of their faults, their tragedies, but they can't overcome it, leading to their catastrophic destruction and death at the denouement, okay? But in this poem, who is the tragic hero? Okay, spend a couple of minutes just thinking about that, make some notes, and really, I know you'll be saying, well, it's either Lamia or it's Lysias, or it's both of them. So make notes on those headings, couple of minutes, then we'll talk a bit more. Okay, so you probably put Lamia, okay? So it is normal, really, to think in an eponymous poem like this, named after, her name's Lamia, the poem's named Lamia, that she is going to be the protagonist and the tragic hero. And in fact, there are some ways in which she seems to correspond to this pattern. So she had a formerly high status and a fall from grace. Yes, that's true. But to do that, you have to look all the way back to the original story of Lamia. Alright, before this poem even begins. I mean, at the beginning, she's this snake-like creature who has to virtually beg Hermes for help, okay? But she is a goddess of sorts, okay? So is that the status we're talking about? Or do we have to go back to before the affair with Zeus, back when she was the queen? We don't get any of that in Keats's poetry. So, does that make her a tragic hero within this poem? That's up to you, really, to have a think about. So she has a fall from grace, alright? Is it grace to begin with? To be a queen who's been picked by Zeus, basically, and then transformed into this monster? Is that a period of grace that she can actually fall from? Or not? And again, this is up to you, the reader. This is for you to have that response too. Okay, so first of all, is there grace to fall from? And then secondly, does she fall? Well, she dies at the end, of course, where she vanishes, she dissolves, whatever. But is it a fall? Is it just a mistake that she makes? If we're just talking about from life to death, well, that happens with everybody. So you've got to wonder, really, as she begins this poem as a snake just writhing around and then this agonizing transformation, and then a woman, well, ostensibly, begging Lycius on the roadside, okay? Is there actually a fall in this poem? And is it a fall from grace? You could argue both ways, couldn't you? But you've got to bear that kind of thing in mind, okay? Hopefully that's the kind of thing you were thinking about. Add it to your notes if not. Then, of course, we've got Lycius. Is he the tragic hero? Now, we know that he's a learned man. He's a scholar. He's intelligent. He is athletic. He is beautiful. So he has everything absolutely going for him. We don't know if he's from noble birth or anything like that. To go back to a kind of Aristotelian definition of status. We don't know that. He's not told that he's a military general like Othello. Already a Thane like Macbeth, or the Prince of Denmark like Hamlet, to use Shakespearean examples. We don't know that about him, but we know he is foremost in Corinth. He's a good guy. He has a good status, even if he's not noble. All right. So let's imagine for a second, then, in this fall from grace, that he does fall from a position of grace. Maybe that qualifies him as being more of a tragic hero than Lamia, because he has everything going for him. And when he meets her, yeah, that is where things start going wrong for him. That is where he has a fall. And he does have a fall in terms of his status amongst the people in Corinth, of course. He goes from being a kind of social, athletic hero within their ranks to being, well, I guess a kind of recluse, and then a guy who kind of dies at his own wedding when his friends come around. So that is definitely a fall. How far it's from grace, again, is up to you. So these are quite useful contrasts to Othello and to some of Keats's other poems as well, really. If you're thinking about tragic heroes, and if you get a question that says, how far do you agree, to what extent do you agree, that there has to be a tragic fall for a text to be a tragedy, these would be kind of interesting counter-arguments, really. Or maybe, the tragic hero is at the centre of all texts. You can argue here that perhaps there's two tragic heroes in this text, maybe. So it's up to you to choose your path through this kind of big question. Alright? Now, it's not just about a fall from grace for a tragic hero as well. They have to have a fatal flaw. They have to have this homage to this characteristic, whether it's excessive pride, jealousy, an unwillingness to act in Hamlet's case, that kind of thing. What is their fatal flaw if they're going to count as a traditional tragic hero? Have a little think, add that to your notes. I think Lysias's fatal flaw is easier to think about, if indeed he has one. He just falls so obsessively in love and rejects all of his own intellectual lessons totally. He gives in to passion. That's probably his fatal flaw. He's completely trusting and completely head over heels with this woman. He doesn't really stop and think, so he is perhaps obsessive about love, quick to act in a Romeo-style fashion, perhaps. That would be his fatal flaw. It's not much of a flaw compared to some of your Shakespearean tragic heroes, of course, but we are a couple of hundred years later. The notion of it changes a little bit. But I think Keats would love to think of himself as a tragic hero who has his fatal flaw is loving too much, yeah? He would love to think of himself like that, so perhaps that's why he writes Lysias that way. Now, Lamia's fatal flaw, this is a really difficult one, because when you go back to the original story, she was picked by Zeus, had this affair with him, that probably didn't really have a lot of choice in that matter, and then she was completely wronged by Zeus's wife, turned into this child-eating monster. What's her fatal flaw in that? I don't know, being victimised. It's like getting a yellow card for being fouled in staff football. You know, that kind of wrong occasionally happens. It's infuriating. Anyway, her fatal flaw when you get to the poem's content itself for Keats is more like she wants to love. She just wants to love and be loved. That's her fatal flaw? Well, that seems really, really mean, doesn't it? If that's what's going to lead to her destruction and downfall. You know, when she makes this deal with Hermes, as this god, who could probably grant her incredible powers and do incredible things, all she wants is to turn into a woman and be able to stand next to a roadside to fall in love with a mortal human man. That's not like, you know, she doesn't want to take over the world or anything. You've got to feel a lot of sympathy for a character who just wants to be loved. That's her fatal flaw. So what is Keats saying here about Fanny and his relationship with her? Obviously, she comes off badly in this poem. She, you know, destroys Lysias's life, destroys Keats's life completely. But at the heart of it, she's not really meaning to be bad. You can see why it's such a multi-layered poem, can't you? So I would say we go from quite a traditional Aristotelian view of tragic heroes when we think about Othello, for the other texts you've had a look at, and then all the way up to the, you know, domestic tragedy of Arthur Miller and Death of a Salesman. You've got almost a complete opposite of a tragic hero, Willy Loman. He's, you know, not noble birth, doesn't have any kind of, you know, a status to fall from, even from the very beginning of the text. So that's a complete transformation, really. And Keats is literally halfway in between them in terms of the years that they were written. A couple of hundred years past Shakespeare, a couple of hundred years before Arthur Miller was writing. But at the same time, he works quite well as being halfway between them in terms of his interpretation of a tragic hero. Oh, that's probably the best I've ever actually explained it. This is probably better than I actually do in class. I know that sounds really arrogant, but, like, seriously, that's probably the best I've ever done. I think I should just stop this bit now. You don't have to write about all of Keats's poems in this exam. That's not what we're doing here. The exam board have said, you know, just one may be enough. Although I'd be very wary about writing about just La Belle Dame because of its obviously being the shortest poem by quite some margin. 1 to 2, maybe. You don't have to consider them all together at any point. That's not what I'm saying here. But what you should have in mind is, where does this poem fit in with the other ones? If I get a question about this or a question about that, which poem am I going to pick? The most important thing to do is to make sure you have the right argument, okay? That you know what you're going to talk about for these poems. And it might be that Lamia is very different from Isabella, and if you picked Isabella to prove one point, that would be kind of mad, and the examiner would be thinking, well, surely there's a better example here from Lamia. So you need to know them all well, but you also need to know what you would argue about them. To do that, let's think about the similarities and differences between the poems. Perhaps you'll say that there's a big difference between the Belle Dame and Lamia, and it'll be those two that you happen to write about, and they're different again from Death of a Salesman. And that kind of helps you to construct where your argument is going for your Section C response of the exam. Okay, so your task. Please think of 2 similarities and 2 differences between Lamia and the other poems. You could do this in the form of a table or a chart, or just write them down and list, whatever you want to do, okay? That will probably take you around 10 minutes, so pause the video here, and after that I'll go through some of the things I thought of, not necessarily better than the ones that you're going to think of, but we can talk through it together in a bit, okay? Give it a go. It's natural to go to La Belle Dame first, but make sure you don't look lazy in the exam by just basing most of your answer on that, because it's tiny compared to the other ones, okay? Every examiner is human, and they'll be thinking a bit, well, this is a bit lazy if they're just talking about La Belle Dame. Anyway, some of the similarities and differences here, I'll talk you through them. First of all, one of those key terms that AQA put out, arousal of fear and pity. That definitely features in both of our poems, okay? We may even pity Lamia, in the poem Lamia. We also pity Lysias. We also pity Lysias because of his fate for just wanting to be a lover, and we are scared for the couple, even though we know about Apollonius. He might kind of be doing the right thing or trying to help. We're also scared there for them and their fate, even though we know it's unavoidable. Okay, it's inevitable. It's fate. It's futile to think about anything else. La Belle Dame does a similar kind of thing, where a woman comes in and is a problematic, disruptive influence in the man's life. And we pity him, we pity the state he ends in because of her. We're scared of her. In both of those poems, it seems that Keats is scared of love and scared of the effect that it can have on him, and scared that it will eventually lead to death, or at least a state of stasis like it is in La Belle Dame. And of course, you don't have to look too far into his biography to understand why that might be. Catastrophe, another key tragedy word in both of them as well. Characters who, Lysias is a fairly high status, well-respected person in Corinth. And of course, the knight. He's a knight, first of all, a knight at arms. It is a catastrophe for both of them to end up, being dead or being completely useless by the end of that poem. One difference is that Lamia is very much a tale of the gods and how they can change your fortunes and mess with you beyond what humans can do. And I think Keats kind of felt in a way that as a mere mortal there wasn't a lot he could do about his fate. He'd probably kind of revel in that misery, to be honest, knowing Keats. But at the same time, his was, of course, a life full of personal tragedies too. La Belle Dame doesn't really deal with the gods. It deals with the more fairy setting, a kind of supernatural fairy's child, witch-like, spellbinding character. We have a spell, really, from Lamia as well, don't we, the language we spoke about. But that is more on the supernatural side than the god side, certainly not involving Greek mythology and things like that as well. I think in both of those poems, though, you could say that Keats likes to think that there are other puppet masters messing us up for things, and that our tragedies are, in some ways, fate beyond our control. And both of them feature a tragic fall of sorts. Again, that's kind of up to you to decide whether that's Lysias or Lamia or both or neither. But there is a fall from a status to a state of, well, death, nothingness. And La Belle Dame, the tragic fall of the night, obviously. So both of those correspond quite well to tragedy, and there's quite a lot of similarities between those two. So when you're thinking about which you're going to respond with in the exam, obviously if you got a question about the gods and you were desperate to write about La Belle Dame, you wouldn't do that. That would be a mad thing to do. Lamia would be your go-to poem to use there. So you need to know them all pretty well and know how they work in relation to each other. I think I've said that already. Sorry. Next one. The Eve of St. Agnes then. Different themes in this one, but some similarities as well, okay? Both about dreams and realities, but in different ways. And the way I've even phrased it there is very much like what your exam response would be like. Yeah, they're both about this, but in different ways, or two different ends, or whatever it might be. Okay, so you're starting to tweak and form and pick a line of argument through, okay? In Lamia, dreams invade reality. Lysias knows that Lamia can't be real. He doesn't, ask her for her name, or at least her family name, for a huge chunk of the poem. He thinks she must be some kind of goddess or nymph when he meets her, and that impression never really leaves him all the way through. He kind of knows it isn't real, and that's why he hides away from Apollonius. Anyway, but he didn't ask for that dream to pick him. She chose him on the roadside, literally, and that dream has kind of in some ways attacked him. Now, dreams and reality are very different in the Eve of St. Agnes, where, Madeline is dreaming and has this dream about Porphyro, and when she wakes up and sees him there, the real version of him, she's a bit disappointed. That wasn't as good as my dream, basically. I always find that so rude. But anyway, you're not as nice as you are in my dreams. But anyway, this is a different kind of thing. This is dreams versus reality, rather than the one invading the two. Now, in both of them, if it could just be the dream, Keats would be happy. Everybody would be happy. He much preferred the world of dreams to the world of reality. And for somebody who, saw the pretty hideous things that went on in his life involving, illness and disease and suppression of the population, all those kind of things, a dream world to escape into is kind of perfect, really, for Keats. So there you go. Both, I've kind of put question mark for death here. Death featuring obviously at the end of Lamia and Lysias in a very clear fashion. But the end of Eve is one that people talk about. And they are gone long ago out into the night, yeah? Does that mean they're dead when they're gone? Or does it mean they've actually escaped out of there to a beautiful, romantic, kind of happily ever after? I prefer to think that. So one of the key terms on AQA's lists is positives emerging. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find them in many poems. And there really isn't much of that going on in Lamia at all. Yeah? But in Eve of St. Agnes, you could potentially say some positives at the end where the family are overcome and the two people escape into the night. When you think about it, the family in the castle being a barrier to Porphyro's appearance there, being his mortal enemies, they'll kill him and all that kind of stuff. That's almost an inverted thing to what's going on in Lamia, where he invites all the outsiders in and they spell doom. So in both of those poems, even though they're quite different with very different endings, it suggests that society is bad and you have to escape it in one way or another. Lysias makes the mistake of inviting society in, and that creates obviously the problems with Apollonius at the wedding and stuff like that as well. Whereas Porphyro and Madeline, they escape it. Yeah, everybody is drunk and they leave the castle, and that's the only route to success. You can imagine Keats very clearly thinking, I'm going to write some poems here where society is bad. Okay. Now, in terms of people's agency themselves, their actual ability to change their fate, Lamia is full of misjudgments, from Lysias making the decisions that he does to, first of all, completely fall head over heels with Lamia and ignore the fact that she's some kind of crazy goddess snake woman. Just not really question himself too much about that relationship, to Lamia's misjudgment in itself, becoming woman, becoming, I guess, mortal again, really, after that arrangement with Hermes, and trying to have a relationship when she knows she can't really do that. So misjudgments from loads of characters in Lamia, whereas in Eve of St. Agnes, it's more about the deception of Porphyro to get into there, into the castle in the first place. Angela, her kind of cheating her own employers, basically, to help him along there. So lots of deception going on there. Of course, there's deception in Lamia as well. But I fear that's more about their misjudgments rather than the kind of good intentions that they have there. And Isabella. Okay, Isabella and Basil, different again, similar again in different ways, but you think your way through. Okay, I think Eve may be the counter-argument to a lot of things here that you'll see similar in Lamia and Isabella. Okay, both eponymous poems, both female protagonists. One in Lamia I've put who does wrong. She does wrong. She is the instigator of the problems for Lysias. She knows that's going to end badly, or even if she's hoping it isn't, she should know, really. Whereas in Isabella, very clearly this time, the female protagonist is wronged. And if you think about Madeline from Eve as well, and you think about La Belle Dame, you've got a couple of female protagonists who do the wrong thing. Okay, they kind of act as the antagonist for the man in a way. They are the catalyst of a downfall. Whereas Isabella obviously is clearly wronged, and unbelievably tragic effects. And in this one, you can say very much the victim of men, not just her love in the first place, but of her brothers and their actions, of course. So absolutely a victim versus a villain, perhaps, with those two there. So, maybe you might find yourself writing about that. Both deal with the aftermath of key events. Now, for Lamia, those key events might happen before the poem even begins in the first place, with all the actual original tale from Greek mythology. And everything we get after is kind of like a well after the real story. Isabella, focusing the aftermath, obviously, of Lorenzo's death, okay? And really, looking at the effects on her, the deterioration in her, well, I don't know, I guess you could say sanity, but certainly emotional state, her inability to overcome it, and the ghostly return of Lorenzo and that kind of stuff. So both of these are looking at a kind of hopeless situation because they are both an aftermath, and that is absolutely appropriate to a tragedy, isn't it? We're looking at how people attempt to pick up the pieces of their lives unsuccessfully in both cases. Pure Keats right there. Last point then. Lamia, to some extent, I believe, internal causes of tragedy. Her desperation to be loved, her poor decision-making in terms of what she does with Lysias, his poor decision-making in terms of suggesting that they get married and opening it up to society, stuff like that as well in terms of relationship. Very much things that they've done wrong themselves, okay? Isabella, it's not really her fault here, is it? Well, not really, not at all. Very much external causes, the patriarchal society deciding who she can and can't be in love with, and her brothers destroying her life completely. So very much a villain-type character. So in some ways, these are quite different, these poems, when you look at it like that. I feel like I'm changing my mind all the time, but of course it depends on what you're writing about. If you get a question that says something like, the problems and tragedies are created from within, to what extent do you agree? That'd be an amazing question, wouldn't it? For Death of a Salesman, you might be saying stuff like, well, it comes from within because he's got the wrong dreams and the wrong role models in his body and stuff like that as well. But you'd also say that society and society's changes, the American dream, capitalism, all that kind of stuff. So for Death of a Salesman, there's kind of blend of internal, external causes of tragedies. And then you might want to say for Lamia, there's internal, for Isabella, there's external, and just blend it like that if you were to talk about those two in the exam. No more than two, don't go crazy here, people. And of course, it can just be one of the longer ones. But you get my point, don't you? And it really helps to think about that in relation to each other, just so you know what you're going to say. Yeah? This isn't A-level memory. So many people think this is A-level memory. Yeah? They just think, I know the poems, I've analysed them, I've done a beautiful anthology, I know what I'm doing, I know everything about them. And they go in to the exam and they've never really had to think about what they're going to say. You should have done all of your thinking before you go into the exam. Okay, and then you can just, get your ideas out and plan, and we'll talk about that more, obviously. But you're thinking, you're knowing where this fits into your own thought processes. That should be done. That is such a rant. I'm sorry. But I hope that is useful, and we will pick up next lesson with some more big questions and tasks there. Well done today, folks!